Okay, so we're finally going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas. And what is the Gospel of Thomas? Well, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. And these kinds of works would have been known as Logia. In fact, many believe that the hypothetical Q document would be a similar document to the Gospel of Thomas. And when it was discovered, some people initially tried to say, well, maybe this is the Q document. But most don't believe that now because it doesn't have enough similarities with Matthew and Luke to be this hypothetical document. But if that document existed, which I don't believe it does, this is the kind of document that would be. There is no story to it at all, so we don't have context to these particular sayings. It's a series of 114 sayings that are attributed to Jesus Christ. It was found in an area of the Middle East called Nag Hammadi, while they were doing a dig for other construction works in 1945. It was found there was actually a library of different documents. This was in a codex, which they called the second because it was the second that was found. And within Codex number 2, it is the second book out of 7. And it's in Coptic, it's not in Greek. It was written in approximately, or this particular document was dated to approximately 340 AD. The hypothesis is that these works were buried because there were edicts at that time in the 4th century, which made it illegal to have them. It's hard to say. But many use this document to try and say that Christianity tried to change the teachings of Jesus in line with the proposal of the Da Vinci Code. And they use this specific gospel. This is one of the most popular out of all of the non-canonical works that is circulating. It's supposedly written, obviously, by the Apostle Thomas. And we do have other similar fragments, so fragments that are of this document in Greek that are dated to around 200 AD. And I was able to look at those as well. The fragments that we have they say they make up about 20%, but reading through them, some of them, the words are so broken, I'd say it only makes up between 10 and 15% of the document. And what's interesting is that there are so many differences, even in these tiny fragments that we have, between the Greek version from 200 AD and then the versions that are found in Coptic in 340 AD. And that distinguishes it from the tradition that we have of the canonical Gospels. Because even though people like Bart Ehrman, historians like Bart Ehrman, have written books about all of the differences that there are between all of the different translations of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we can really say is that those differences, again, Ehrman was forced to admit this in a debate he had with Wallace, which you could find online on YouTube. Again, Wallace points out that most of these are spelling differences. Like 95% of the differences that Ehrman likes to talk so much about are just spelling differences, or sometimes they are a substitution of a synonym, so words that mean the same thing as they were copied down. So they don't actually change the text. And any differences that we have found when we have unearthed older versions are always noted in your Bible. So if you look at your Bible, like I said, I have the Oxford version, which has some very secular notes in it, but I read those, obviously. We'll point out every single place where there's a discrepancy. For example, there's stories, the story of let he who is without sin cast the first stone, which is, I believe it's John chapter 8, the first block that is in chapter 8, of the adulterous woman. One of my favorite stories, but that is not in every single manuscript. So it's noted. But there are very few of these. There are very few differences in the canonical Gospels, in the different translations that we have found. And we have so many fragments and copies of these from basically from the 2nd century on, okay? The earliest fragment that we have is from 125. The earliest fragment of Thomas that we have is from 200, and we just don't have the multitude of them. We also don't have many references to this text before 200 AD. Now, that does not necessarily mean that this is not one of the original Gospels. That wouldn't be enough to rule it out. But it certainly is strange because there are other non-canonical works like the Gospel of the Hebrews that I have mentioned many times, that the generation after Peter and Paul, so what we call like the church fathers, the church leaders after the first generation of apostles, that these church fathers quote all of the canonical Gospels that we have. They were listed on the Muratorian fragment. And they also quoted Gospels that we have eliminated, like the Gospel of the Hebrews. So it's not that they only quoted the canonical Gospels. Mostly they quoted the canonical Gospels. But not the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas comes up in around the 3rd century, with people criticizing it. So that's one reason that you would think that this is a later document. Again, not all scholars agree about this. There's some scholars that like to say, oh, no, this was from 50 AD. There is a professor named Elaine Pagels, I believe her name is. But again, it's much closer to Greek philosophy than it is to Jewish teachings. And you would expect the first initial Christian documents to be closer to Jewish teachings than to international Greek philosophy. And so it wouldn't make any sense for there to be first a Gospel of Thomas and then take a step back towards the Hebrew teachings of that time with the Gospel of Matthew and then Mark and Luke. It's the opposite of what we would expect as far as ideas go. Another scholar that dates it as later, and his reasons for it have to do with the translation of the text, is Perrin, Nicholas Perrin. He says it must be from around the time of 160, 150 AD, so mid-2nd century, because we have other works from Syria, like the Sentences of Sextus and the Diocletian, that have more in common with this document than the canonical Gospels. It follows a tradition that's closer to the Syrian tradition of that time. Now, other scholars say that Perrin's wrong. This is a stretch. I think that the best evidence against the Gospel of Thomas is the document itself. And so I read it. I read all of it. I read it with a commentary that believes that it's got some sort of secret teaching to it, because I wanted to be fair. In the notes and the commentary that I was reading, it tries to connect these sayings to the Gospels, the canonical Gospels. And while it's true that many of the sayings are similar, about 2/3 of the sayings are similar to the parables and stories and beatitudes that we find in the canonical Gospels, they're not really as they should be. And many of them don't even make any sense. It's very much as if someone had heard these through the oral tradition, which was very strong at that time, and hadn't memorized them yet and tried to write them down. And as they were writing them down, they filtered them through their own ideas when they couldn't remember everything exactly. That's what it really feels like. There's nothing really offensive about this text. I don't think Christians should be afraid to read texts like this, especially because sunlight is the best disinfectant for misinformation. So the more we know about this type of work, the better arguments that we have when it comes to discussion and debate about them. I couldn't really read all of it without laughing, because some of the things it says are just, they're silly. They're not even, it's as if they're trying to be deep, but it just doesn't it doesn't work, which is not the feeling that you get when you read the stories that are in the canonical Gospels that Jesus Christ was telling his followers. It just doesn't have that sort of universal truth to it. You have this idea that someone is trying to create codes and other things, and so you have to kind of fish for meaning. So what does it say? Well, it begins with this idea of hidden knowledge. These are the hidden teachings. And some people would say that this is already proof that whoever wrote this was well aware that there were other gospels out there, and that this would sort of be conflicting with the teachings that the other gospels were saying were of Jesus. So these are the secret teachings. These are the teachings that you're only going to find in this book. Okay, in and of itself, it's not a terrible thing, but the second saying, which they call in the version that I'm reading Longinus, but we'll say sayings to make it easier. The second saying is similar to the seek and ye shall find, and knock and the door shall be opened. But then it goes on to talk about knowing once you find that knowledge, you will be marveled, and after being marveled, you will reign, you will become part of the kingdom of heaven, and then you will rest. Now that changes from the Greek to the Coptic, because then the Coptic adds to that first you will be dismayed and then you will be marveled, and it eliminates the part about resting. So we have some pretty big differences already in the second saying. In the third saying, we have this idea of looking for the kingdom of heaven. Oh, where's the kingdom of heaven? Well, if it's in the sky, the birds already know it. If the secret knowledge is in the sea, then the fish already know it. You have to find it within yourself, which is very New Agey. Everything in this document is it's funny that over 2,000 years, the alternative theories about consciousness, they come up, and this is not that different from the sort of New Agey self-actualization sort of ideas. In the commentary that I'm reading, they try to connect this to Matthew 24 and Deuteronomy 3. And Matthew 24 is really talking about false teachers. Jesus is trying to warn people to not believe the false people that will come and say that he has returned in the second coming. So if they tell you he's in the forest, don't believe them. If they tell you, he's here, he's there, don't believe them. And Deuteronomy really is talking about the kingdom of heaven and where you should look for it, but it certainly doesn't talk about going within to find it. So neither of the passages listed as connected to this specific this specific saying in Thomas, neither one of them are really connected as much as the author wanted to propose that they were, which is why it's always important to have your Bible handy while you're reading a text like this so you can go and look immediately. Then we have sayings 8 and 9, and 9 is very much more or less the parable of the sower. It's not that much changed. 8 instead, it's almost like they tried to mismatch different parables, different stories that Jesus told his followers. So we have this idea of a fisherman that catches a lot of fish, but there's one really good fish, so he throws out all the other fish. And as we know, there is a story that's like that, which of course is the pearl. A man finds a pearl, and then he sells everything else that he has to have that pearl, which of course is when you find salvation, right? And in that, what Jesus is teaching is that material possessions are not important, that it's salvation that is the most important thing that one can have. And it's repeated in the idea about a piece of land, that there's a treasure in this piece of land, and the man sold everything to have this piece of land. This is, again, in Thomas, this is mixed with another teaching about the angels that would come down with their nets, right, and pull up those that are saved. Okay, so when we talk about when we will all be recalled to heaven, and then of course the small fish will be thrown out and the good fish will be kept. But again, the Gospel of Thomas kind of puts all those ideas together, and it doesn't really work as well as what we see in the canonical Gospels. It's not offensive. but it's just, you get the feeling that when you're reading it, it's not right. Okay, so I know I need to make an ending for part 1 because I went over 30 minutes. I'm going to have to find a spot to cut this properly at around the 15-minute mark, I think. Wherever I'm going to find that point, this is going to be the end of part 1, and I will finish it with a separate video that will be part 2. And I'll try to put the videos out like one after the other almost immediately. But just thank you for bearing with me on this. Like I said, I wanted to really break it down because I had seen other videos about the Gospel of Thomas, and specifically Inspiring Philosophy did a great video on the Gospel of Thomas, but I think that a lot of people criticize it without telling you what's in it. And I really wanted to give you an idea of what is in this document and what the discussion is all about. So with that, I guess this is the end of part 1. Thank you for sticking with me through this, and God bless.